I think it takes a unique combination, though, because where Trump got tripped up with draining the swamp, gutting the deep state, is what the same members of that managerial class told him when he got into office. They told him lies, but lies that he was forced to believe because he didn't have independent knowledge to know any better, which is that you can't fire civil servants without running afoul of the civil service protections, which are these extensive laws designed to protect individual bureaucrats from firing by the US president. Trump's instincts were in the right place. I actually think he was an excellent president in this regard, but he was not able to implement his own agenda. He was able to expose the problem because the people around him told him a bunch of lies. Why are they lies? Well, my suggestion is read the law. Just those civil service protections, to use one example among hundreds, those civil service protections protect against individual employee firings. They do not apply to mass layoffs on their own terms. The law just doesn't apply to mass layoffs. Mass layoffs are absolutely what I am bringing to the DC bureaucracy. I have said that I will lay off over 75% of the federal employee bureaucrat headcount by the end of the first term, 50% by the end of the first year. And we've already offered unprecedented detail on exactly how we will do it, on which of the remaining minority employees in the FBI, minority number of employees, will move to the US Marshals or to the Drug Enforcement Agency or to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, which small sliver of the US Department of Education will move to the US Department of Labor, so that we neither need an FBI nor a Department of Education. And we can get into those details, but you're asking about a question of personal attribute. And I think that the personal attribute that really matters here is that we need a US president that is at once an outsider to that system, uncaptured, unbeholden by the donor class and the managerial class, but at the same time who has a deep, first personal, bone deep understanding of how to actually get that job done, and a deep understanding of the laws and the Constitution of this country.
Okay,
that is what I think is actually a rare combination that I'm bringing to the table.
Okay, let me ask you about that, because that's very, very complicated. So, first of all, it is the case that in most large-scale institutions, a small number of people do almost all the productive work, right? That's the square root law. Okay, so if you have 10,000 employees, 100 of them are doing half the work. Now, we saw a stellar example of that in Musk's takeover of Twitter, because he dispensed with about 80% of the employees, and all he did was improve the company. Now, Musk has had extensive experience doing that sort of thing with other companies, and he's obviously able to separate the wheat from the chaff. Now, you just made the case that you would like to do the same thing, and you also said that you had a detailed plan to do so. And so what I'm very curious about is, how is it that you believe you will be able to decide who should stay and who should go? And how is it that you've developed this detailed plan? Like, what sort of analysis have you conducted that enables you to determine what should be shrunk and how, and to know that that's going to cause beneficial rather than damaging consequences?
So there's something we have going for us here, is that I don't have to start in a vacuum. There is this thing we call the US Constitution, already proven, time-tested, to be the best operating manual for a nation and preserving liberty and human history. That's certainly my view. Well, it turns out that much of the excess we have seen came from running afoul of that operating document. So many of the administrative agencies that were created in a manner that Congress actually never gave those agencies the power to wield the power that they do. The Supreme Court has, in the last 2 years, already begun to recognize that. West Virginia versus EPA, a case where the Supreme Court held that the EPA's climate-focused regulations on the coal industry, were unconstitutional because we, the people, never gave the government that authority. And Congress, in turn, never gave that authority to this three-letter agency, which nonetheless ran afoul. Well, if those EPA regulations are unconstitutional, then it turns out most of the federal regulations today are also unconstitutional. Turns out most of the employees implementing those regulations are actually unnecessary. So in many ways, I don't think we have to start in some first principles whiteboard of a vacuum and say, how are we going to design and draw this up? That would be a fatal conceit, I think. That would be hubris, I think, designed for failure, to think that one man, Elon Musk or myself or anybody else, it's just not going to happen. It's destined for failure. But if you're following a time-tested framework for the operating manual for this nation, an operating manual built in the shadow of the Declaration of Independence, the greatest mission statement for a free society in human history, well, then I think we actually are doing nothing more than implementing that which is already time-tested and true. And so, I don't want to, short sell myself here I'm 37 years old. I've built multiple multi-billion-dollar companies. I do understand that if somebody works for you and you can't fire them, that means they don't work for you. I understand what meritocratic hiring looks like. You work for them. You're in some ways their slave because you're responsible for what they do without any authority to change it. So I understand these principles, but it's not that experience-based, not Donald Trump's, not Musk's, not mine, that could be sufficient to get this right at the level of the nation. It is actually a firm understanding and commitment to the Constitution itself. And that brings me back to that rare combination. You can't rely on your advisors for that. That is not a substitute for saying, okay, I'm bringing executive experience and then I'm going to ask my advisors how it's done within this legal framework and ask the lawyers. And I think that's the difference between me and Trump. And I think that'd be the difference between me or someone like an Elon Musk or anybody else who is great as a business builder and is a good alternative to the professional political class doing this in Washington, D.C. But I think it requires a deep, intellectual, historical, principled understanding, passion for, and commitment to that Constitution to see that through, but not doing it as somebody who's coming in as just a law professor or a lawyer. They're not going to have the skill set to the fortitude to cut and see that through. And that explains why we haven't had leaders to that effect yet, because that is a rare combination. Those skill sets aren't supposed to go together, right? These are different skill sets for a reason.
Why did they go together in your case?
I hope they do.
But why do they? Why do you think they do? What is it about your background and your interests that make it reasonable for you to make the claim that you exist at that intersection between, like, legal prowess, let's say, and wisdom in relationship to the Constitution and that entrepreneurial bent? What do you have on that front that, say, Trump doesn't have?
Yeah, so the first thing I'll say is I'm not going to claim to be some messiah coming from on high with exactly the prescription. But what called me into this race, when you and I first started getting to know each other, I would have said we were both nuts if we were thinking about me running for U.S. president. I was driving change in the private sector. I started Strive. I was writing books. That was my calling. So the thing that pulled me in, Dr. Peterson, is that I think I am the best among the lot we have now to actually bring that combination to the White House at a moment where we require it, to actually reform that administrative state, to gut and bring a revolution to that administrative state.